Draw near, observer of power's complexities. For tonight, I must speak of the moment when the mightiest of alliances shatter not through external force, but through the very virtues that made them powerful in the first place. The voice you hear belongs to one who has sat in councils where the fate of nations hangs on ancient pride and divine ambition. This chronicle unfolds deep beneath the spine of the world, in caverns carved by claws that predate human civilization, where walls of accumulated treasure catch the light of magical flames, and the echoes of wings that could blot out the sun fill chambers vast beyond mortal comprehension. It is a tale of assumptions shattered by inconvenient questions, of independence valued above promised dominion, and of the moment when servants realize they have never been truly servants at all. So prepare yourself for the kind of betrayal that comes not from treachery, but from wisdom, friend, as I share the Dragon Council's betrayal. Deep beneath the spine of the world, in caverns that had been carved by dragon claws eons before the first human cities rose from the wilderness, the ancient Council of Wyrms convened for the first time in 3 centuries. The vast chamber echoed with the sounds of wings that could blot out the sun and voices that could shake mountains, as dragons of every chromatic hue gathered to witness what many believed would be the final chapter in the age-old struggle between their kind and the lesser races that infested the surface world. The meeting hall itself was a testament to draconic power and vanity, its walls adorned with treasures that represented its accumulated wealth of a dozen kingdoms. Golden coins formed cascading waterfalls that caught the light of magical flames, while precious gems had been embedded in the stone walls to create intricate mosaics depicting the great deeds of dragonkind throughout history. Ancient weapons and artifacts lined alcoves, carved specifically to display trophies taken from defeated enemies, to one telling a story of draconic superiority over those foolish enough to challenge their might. Severin the Red, the cult's new supreme leader, following Rezmir's mysterious disappearance during the catastrophic failure at Skyreach Castle, stood at the center of the council chamber, his human form dwarfed by the massive shapes that surrounded him, yet commanding their attention through the sheer force of his conviction. The ritual scars that covered his arms glowed with draconic magic, marking him as one who had been chosen to serve as a bridge between mortal ambition and divine draconic will. But even his enhanced presence seemed fragile in this place where ancient powers brooded over grievances that stretched back to the dawn of the world. The young cult leader had inherited an organization in crisis. The failure of the great ritual at Skyreach Castle had not only cost them their mobile fortress and scattered their forces, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about the wisdom of their cause and the competence of their leadership. Rezmir's disappearance, whether through death, capture, or simple abandonment of a lost cause, had left a power vacuum that Severin was struggling to fill. Now, faced with the most crucial negotiation in the cult's history, he understood that failure here would mean the end of everything they had worked toward for generations. "Honored ancestors," Severin began, his voice amplified by magical arts to carry clearly through the vast space. "The time of prophecy has come. The stars align as they have not done for a millennium. The ritual sites have been prepared across the continent, and the dragon masks have been gathered. Though we face setbacks at Skyreach Castle, our cause remains righteous, and our ultimate victory inevitable. Soon our queen will return to reclaim her rightful dominion over this realm, and all who have opposed us will bow before her terrible majesty." The response was a rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain, as dozens of dragon voices expressed their approval in harmonious roars that spoke of anticipation building for centuries. But not all the voices joined in that chorus of approval. In the shadows, at the chamber's edge, Older dragons watched with eyes that held not excitement, but careful calculation. Their ancient minds weighing possibilities that younger worms had not yet learned to consider. These elder dragons had lived through previous attempts to overthrow the established order, had witnessed the rise and fall of empires that had seemed invincible in their time, and had learned to be suspicious of any plan that promised easy victory over forces that had maintained their power for millennia. They had also heard disturbing reports from their younger kin about the growing resistance to the cult's activities, the unexpected alliances forming between traditionally antagonistic groups, and the innovative tactics being employed by their enemies. Klauth the Old, a red dragon so ancient that his scales had taken on the color of dried blood, and his eyes held the wisdom of ages, raised his massive head to address the assembly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries and the authority of one who had ruled when Severin's ancestors were still learning to make fire. The other dragons fell silent immediately, understanding that Klauth's words would carry more weight than any amount of passionate rhetoric from the young human who stood before them. "Bold words, young priest," he rumbled, his voice carrying undertones that spoke of vast experience with the gap between ambitious plans and harsh reality. "But tell us of the costs. What price will our queen's return exact from those who serve her? What fate awaits this world when her reign begins? And perhaps most importantly, what assurance do we have that this attempt will succeed where so many others have failed?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Severin to confront implications that the cult's rhetoric had always glossed over, with promises of glory and dominion. The return of Tiamat would indeed bring power to those who served her, but it would also fundamentally alter the nature of the world in ways that even her most devoted followers might find difficult to accept. The young cult leader had spent so much time focusing on the mechanics of summoning their goddess, he had given relatively little thought to what would happen afterward. "The weak will serve the strong, as nature intended," Severin replied, his voice carrying the certainty of one who had never questioned the fundamental assumptions of his faith. "The chaos that has plagued this realm for millennia will be replaced by perfect order, with each creature knowing their place in the great hierarchy that our queen will establish. Dragons will rule as they were meant to rule, and lesser beings will find their purpose in service to their betters." But Klauth's ancient eyes narrowed as he studied the human who dared to speak of draconic destiny with such presumption. The old dragon had lived long enough to understand that perfect order was often indistinguishable from perfect stagnation, and that the chaos Severin spoke of dismissively was often the source of the growth and change that made existence interesting. Moreover, he had begun to suspect that the cult's vision of dragon rule might not align with his own understanding of what it meant to be a truly free and powerful being. "And what of freedom, priest? What of the right of dragons to choose their own paths, to pursue their own interests without being bound to the will of another? Even one as mighty as our queen. We are not creatures born to serve. We are beings of supreme independence, each of us a force unto ourselves. How do you reconcile your vision of perfect order with our essential nature?" The challenge struck at the heart of the contradiction that had always existed within the cult's ideology, but had never been directly confronted. Dragons were indeed creatures of supreme independence, driven by instinct and desires that could not easily be channeled into collective action. The very characteristics that made them powerful, their pride, their territorial nature, their refusal to submit to any authority but their own, made them poor servants, even to one of their own kind who claimed divine status. The uncomfortable silence that followed Klauth's question was broken by other ancient voices beginning to join the discussion, revealing fissures in what Severin had assumed would be universal support for his cause. Each elder dragon who spoke brought their own perspective to bear on the fundamental questions that the cult had always avoided addressing directly. Invernero the Black, whose domains stretched across vast swamplands where no human foot had ever trod, spoke of concerns about the effect that Tiamat's return would have on the delicate balance of magical forces that sustained the natural world. Her voice carried the wisdom of one who had studied the deep mysteries of magic for longer than most civilizations had existed, and her words revealed an understanding of cosmic forces that went far beyond the simplest theology that the cult promoted.
Power such as our queen possesses does not exist without consequence,
she hissed, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from direct experience with forces that could reshape reality itself.
Her presence in this realm will warp the fundamental nature of existence, changing not just the political order, but the very laws that govern life and death. The magical energies required to sustain her manifestation will draw upon sources that currently support the continued existence of countless other forms of life.
Voragamanthar the Copper, known throughout Dragonkind for his cunning intellect and mastery of ancient lore, raised questions about the long-term stability of any order based on the absolute dominion of a single will. His approach to the problem was characteristically analytical, breaking down the cult's promises into component parts and examining each one for logical consistency and practical feasibility. History teaches us that empires built on the suppression of individual will are inherently unstable, he observed, his voice carrying the dry humor that marked his kind, but also a deep seriousness about the implications of what he was discussing. Even our queen, mighty as she is, cannot personally oversee every aspect of existence. She will require servants to implement her will, and servants inevitably interpret that will according to their own understanding and interests. The very perfection you promised contains within it the seeds of corruption and eventual collapse. The debate that followed revealed the depth of the divisions that existed within the draconic community about the wisdom of the cult's plans. While younger dragons were indeed excited by the prospect of their queen's return and the opportunities for conquest and dominion that it would bring, older and wiser worms had serious concerns about the practical implications of such a fundamental change in the cosmic order. As the arguments swirled around the chamber, Severin found himself facing a crisis that the cult's planners had never anticipated. They had assumed that all dragons would naturally support the return of their divine ancestor, but the reality was far more complex. The very independence and intelligence that made dragons such powerful allies also made them incapable of blind obedience, even to one who claimed to be their rightful ruler. The young cult leader's attempts to address the elder's concerns were hampered by his fundamental misunderstanding of draconic psychology. He spoke of glory and power as if these were sufficient motivations for beings who already possessed both in abundance, and he seemed unable to grasp that what the dragons valued most was not the promise of greater dominance, but the preservation of their freedom to choose their own destiny. The turning point came when Bahamut's ancient voice somehow echoed through the chamber, carried by magic that none present could identify or block. The Platinum Dragon's words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the vast space with power that rivaled anything the assembled chromatic dragons could command.
My children.
Bahamut's voice resonated with divine authority and paternal concern.
You speak of order and dominion, but you forget the most fundamental truth of our nature. We are beings of choice, creatures whose very essence is defined by our ability to shape our own destiny. Would you trade that birthright for the illusion of guaranteed victory? Would you surrender the freedom that makes you truly powerful for the security of being powerful servants?
The effect was immediate and dramatic. Several of the younger dragons who had been most enthusiastic about the cult's plans suddenly found themselves questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine. If their divine ancestor spoke against Tiamat's return, if the embodiment of draconic virtue counseled restraint rather than conquest, then perhaps the cult's promises were not as straightforward as they had seemed. Severin attempted to counter Bahamut's influence with arguments about the necessity of strength and the natural order that placed dragons above all creatures. but his merely mortal voice seemed thin and weak after the divine authority that had just filled the chamber. Worse, some of the assembled dragons began to murmur among themselves, sharing doubts and concerns that they had previously kept hidden out of respect for the apparent consensus supporting the cult's cause. The final blow to Severin's hopes came from an unexpected source. Arauthator the White, an ancient dragon whose allegiance to the cult had seemed absolute, fixed the human priest with eyes that burned like frozen stars. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of decision that had been building for months as he observed the cult's methods and contemplated their ultimate implications.
I have served the cause faithfully,
he rumbled, his voice carrying undertones of regret and determination that revealed the difficulty of his decision.
I have provided resources, sanctuary, and my own considerable power to advance the Queen's return. But I will not sacrifice my independence on the altar of another's ambition, even one who claims divine authority. The freedom to choose my own path is worth more than any promise of guaranteed dominion.
The dragon's declaration of withdrawal from the cult's cause sent shockwaves through the assembly, as other worms began to reconsider their own commitments in light of this unexpected defection. If one of their most powerful allies could change sides, then perhaps the cult's victory was not as inevitable as its leaders claimed. Moreover, Arauthator's reasoning resonated with many of the assembled dragons who had been having similar doubts about the wisdom of surrendering their autonomy to any external authority. As the council devolved into arguments and recriminations, with dragons taking sides and ancient alliances fracturing under the pressure of conflicting loyalties, Severin realized that his mission had become something far more dangerous than a simple rally of support. The very convening of the council had exposed weaknesses in the cult's foundation that their enemies could exploit, while the public questioning of Tiamat's goals had given voice to doubts that could spread throughout the draconic community like wildfire. The retreat from the council chamber was a defeat disguised as strategic withdrawal, as Severin and his remaining supporters found themselves forced to abandon their hopes of unified draconic support for the final phase of their plans. Instead of commanding an army of dragons united in purpose, they would have to proceed with a much smaller force, while simultaneously guarding against the possibility that former allies might actively oppose them. But perhaps most dangerous of all was the realization that the cult's greatest weakness was not external opposition, but internal division. The very creatures that claimed to serve in their divine queen's name were capable of independent thought and moral judgment, and many of them were beginning to conclude that the cure offered by the cult might be worse than the disease it claimed to treat. As the word of the council's failure spread through the cult's networks, carried by magical communities that could not entirely conceal the dismay and confusion of those who transmitted them, resistance movements across the continent began to take heart. If the dragons themselves were divided about the wisdom of Tiamat's return, then perhaps the cult's apparent invincibility was more illusion than reality. The Dragon Council's betrayal had opened cracks in what had seemed like an impregnable alliance, and through those cracks, the light of hope began to shine for all who still believed that the world was worth fighting for. The cult would continue their plans, but they would do so without the overwhelming draconic support that had once seemed assured. And their enemies would know that even among the forces of evil, there were those who valued freedom more than power. And so, this tale draws to a close. Though its echoes may linger in your dreams, the fire burns lower now. But don't despair. I've countless more stories waiting to be shared with you. If this tale stirred something within you, if it reminded you why magic still matters in this mundane world, then please, light your own beacon. That glowing thumbs up tells the spirits of story that our fellowship grows stronger. Subscribe to join our circle permanently and ring that notification bell. That way, you'll know the moment I return with new chronicles. The fire burns brightest when more souls gather around it, wouldn't you agree? Now, if that's the case, share this tale with another weary soul who needs it, reminding them adventure still exists. Tag a friend who would appreciate a good story by the fire. The more who believe, the more real these worlds become. And if you're new to our hearth, explore the playlist of chronicles that I've gathered. Tales of heroes and villains, love and loss, magic and mystery. Each one carefully chosen for souls like yours. Until the fire calls us together again, may your own adventures be worthy of legend, and may you never lose the wonder that brought you here tonight. Travel or sleep well, brave soul. The long rest awaits your return.